If you go to Belchertown, Massachusetts, you may see a myriad of abandoned brick buildings covered in plants that are closed off to the public. That place used to be the largest institution in Belchertown, the Belchertown State School for the Feeble-Minded. It was a town within a town, some called it. It had nursery buildings, a schoolhouse, a farm that supplied food for all of its residents, its own system of tunnels where a local coal plant distributed steam heat, its own water system, and a telephone switchboard that the local fire department used as a dispatch. Despite all of that, this town within a town, behind closed doors, held some of the most horrific scandals seen to the human eye. After well-intentioned ideas had begun to fall, the public had seen Belchertown State School's crimes against humanity, and a court case, the Belchertown State School closed permanently in 1992.
The Progressive Era at the turn of the century heavily influenced the institutionalization of the mentally ill. The Progressives' dream was to revolutionize and change the lives of people with developmental disabilities by educating them and providing them with housing in an institution. In addition to education reform and advocacy for institutions, the Progressives also believed in eugenics, the idea that populations of certain peoples, in this case people with mental illnesses, should be controlled. Eugenics provided the guiding ideology behind the first IQ tests. These tests were used to classify students into segregated and unequal educational pathways, to establish the first gifted programs, and to promote the idea that educational attainment should be measured simply by a numerical score. Eugenicist ideas about intellectual worth of students permeated the American educational structure and resulted in the creation of state schools across the country. The Belchertown State School for the Feeble-Minded was initially purchased in 1915. By then, there was already the Fernald and Wrentham State Schools, and the state wanted a third in Western Mass. Belchertown lobbied for the state school to be there because it would boost the town's economy and cause a huge influx in population and job opportunities. The state chose Belchertown because it was fairly isolated, yet still connected to Boston by both road and train and near some commercial areas. After the purchase of most of the 876 acres of the state school, the farm was established first. The farm would eventually feed all of the residents in the institution and export dairy. Even though it was purchased in 1915, the state school didn't open until 1922, when a viable water source was found for the institution.
After 4 years of the state school farm being in operation, the Massachusetts Board of Insanity chose George E. McPherson to be the first superintendent of the Belchertown State School. Before that, he was the assistant commissioner of the State Department of Mental Diseases, and it was his boss, Commissioner George M. Klein, who recommended Mr. McPherson to the Board of Insanity. McPherson hosted a progressive era vision for the state school to provide specialized education for people with disabilities and teaching them skills that would be adaptable to the real world.
In the early days of the state school, they really wanted to be able to showcase everything that they were doing. And this was a huge event for them. They had an exhibit every year to show off what the residents had done and what they had learned, and to welcome the townspeople in so that they could come in and see what the state school was all about. They had a really strong relationship with the town early on. The townspeople spent a lot of time on the state school campus and spent a lot of time with the residents. So they would put up all of the weavings that they had done. They would put up all of the clothing that they had made. There were also, this one is actually a farm exhibit. You can see some of the flowers and vegetables that came out of the farm. They also did examples of what the residents' rooms looked like.
During the beginning years of the state school, they had only a fraction of the buildings still left standing today. In the first few years, they had only 3 girls' dormitories, 2 boys' dormitories, 1 girl and 1 boy industrial building, and the laundry building. The school had about 600 to 800 residents, and even then they struggled to fit everyone somewhere. There wasn't an empty bed in the boys' dormitory, and classrooms were filled beyond capacity. Initially, the classrooms, assembly hall, and gym were located in the laundry building, but by 1932, the schoolhouse was built and it consisted of not only classrooms, but an assembly hall that seated 1,200, a gymnasium, a library, and a clubroom for employees with pool tables and 2 bowling alleys. 1932 was the same year that most of the Core Cottage plan had been completed.
So this is one of the picnic pavilions being built, which unfortunately does not stand any longer, but there were a few of those on the campus. These are the employee cottages, of which there were 9. And this is the boys' industrial building being built. And the administration building used to have beautiful gates up in front with a stone wall, which unfortunately is no longer there.
During McPherson's time as superintendent, there were also many residents who were institutionalized who did not have a developmental disability, and a lot of them aided in the general operations of the institution. While McPherson was superintendent, the school's rules were fairly lax. Unlike its later years, you could leave the school for a weekend and come back when you wanted. Some employees and townspeople would take residents home for a weekend. At the same time, residents of the state school were treated well by the staff, while still staying inside the contemporary norms. This would not stay the same forever. After World War II, the school took a turn for the worst, one that would result in the state school's definitive closure.
On June 17, 1943, just before World War II ended, George McPherson passed away, leaving the new superintendent, Henry Tadgell, with a massive predicament.
Everyone loved McPherson. They considered him the father of the institution. And when he passed away and Tadgell was named second superintendent of the institution, he couldn't fill McPherson's shoes. Between Tadgell and then the switch over to Bowser, they were like, all right, we gotta do something here. It's awful. And it was just personality, funding, just a perfect storm of mess, just put Tadgell in a really bad position. But he still has a building named after him.
Simultaneously, by the 1950s, there was a greater push in public education for people with developmental disabilities. Also, parents were more reluctant to send their children to an institution. So, the state school took in people with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities. While this was great outside of the institution, on the inside, this meant that there were less physically capable people taking care of the institution. The result was grouping everything together, which made everything easier and more efficient for the staff, but worse for the residents because they lost a lot of the individual care they needed. People were fed out of dog bowls, where all the food was pureed together. Resident toilets were not privatized. There were no lids on the toilets, only the bare porcelain. There was only one drain in the center of the restroom, and there was no soap provided for the sink. The dorm bedrooms weren't private, most beds touched one another. Residents didn't get to keep their own clothes either. Many of them came with suitcases that were emptied into a communal closet and stored in the back rooms of dorm buildings.
At the Belchertown State School, were there ever forceful sterilization? Were they ever forcefully sterilized?
Yes. And it was frequent during the 1940s. And Tadgell was a huge proponent of eugenics, so sterilization was a big part of that to stop people from passing on the germplasm that created individuals with disabilities or individuals who were poor or had low morality.
Training was also not a resource that the state school had available to itself, as many of the staff now had extra responsibilities because they were low on employees.
A common theme in the reports is that staff were asked to either handle a resident that they weren't prepared or equipped to, that they had to do something for a resident but didn't have the right equipment to do it, such as moving a resident, getting them in and out of the tub or in and out of bed, things like that. So that's when a lot of accidents and injuries happened.
Even though there was all this neglect and abuse happening within the walls of the state school, a massive reform movement was beginning to sprout. In 1954, the Friends of the Belchertown State School formed in order to improve the quality of the institution. This constituency mainly consisted of parents and family of the residents that lived there. Because of the Friends of the Belchertown State School, a lot of activities still remained on campus, such as the carousel. Despite the new improvements headed by the Belchertown State School Friends, a lot of parents didn't get to see what really happened behind closed doors.
It just was so unusual for people to get out and to come back, and so many people, some people had families that would still come and visit, but a lot of people didn't. They just got dropped off there and never saw their families again.
After Tadgell's career had ended, Lawrence Bowser was selected to be the new superintendent.
What was Bowser like?
Bowser was a tyrant. Bowser could have cared less for human rights or any kind of success within the school building.
The administration's apathy affected its residents, which caused a lot of abuse in the ward. People were neglected, feces was smeared on walls, and it was not much different from years prior. But this time, the abuse did not mainly stem from lack of resources, but also intentional malice.
You could sense that need to feel comfortable with one another, but we were told you can't have favorites, you can't bring anyone home. If you're going to go to that building, you can't take the same people all the time. There are people who lived there who wanted state fathers and state mothers. I remember Charlene, that person, will you be my state father?
Yeah.
I didn't even know what that meant. But the people who lived there would adopt a staff person they felt good about just so they could say they have a state father or a state mother.
Overall, during Bowser's time, abuse and neglect were a common theme throughout the institution.
Not a peep about the horrors happening at Belchertown when outside campus walls. The town had no idea. But then, during the 1970s, everything came crashing down for the institution. In 1970, James M. Shanks wrote The Tragedy of Belchertown, and it was scathing. According to Shanks, after penetrating the double-locked doors of Building K, the men's back ward, one entered a stench created by 48 years of neglect, urine, and human waste. Smell and sight are overpowered by the stink in the building. Conditions in the women's back ward, Building A, were, if anything, worse. Where the men of Building K had recently begun eating their food with utensils from a plate, each woman still ate from a deep aluminum bowl in which soup, meat, vegetables, and dessert were all mixed in a single bowl. 2 of the women, who were said to be taking food from the others, were restrained. One woman was tied in a grotesque and uncomfortable position with her whole body tied to the bench like a pretzel, twisted over itself. The other woman was in a homemade straitjacket, one leg also bound to the bench. 2 years following the tragedy of Belchertown, UMass professor Ben Ricci sued the state school on the basis that it violated the constitutional rights of its residents, including the right to minimally adequate care, but the process started long before then.
Ben was a member of the Friends of Belchertown, and that was a group that advocated for the people of Belchertown, the parents. I was not in that at that time. And he went in to Belchertown. He was not supposed to go inside. They always came out with a person with a keychain, because a lot of doors were locked. And if you wanted to see somebody in there, you had to wait, and then they brought the person out. You never went to go in there. Ben went in. He somehow got in. He saw people sitting in their feces. He saw lots of awful things, and children who were really young laying, and they were using the residents of Belchertown to change their diapers.
When Ben Ricci saw the horrors his own son had been living through, he searched for months and eventually found a lawyer who would take his case pro bono. After months of newspaper articles and court hearings, the case was eventually settled with several consent decrees by Judge Joseph Toro, who went back to the Belchertown State School to personally check things had improved, and for years after that continued to make sure they were enforced. The consent decrees gave money to the state school because it raised the standards the state school had to follow by a significant amount, and the decrees followed one major philosophy: communitization. Communitization, also known as normalization, was an effort to integrate institutionalized peoples into their communities. It was the other side to the growing trend deinstitutionalization, which was the attempt to downsize and shut down institutions. Communitization had been a growing trend across the nation since the 1950s, and in 1966 the state had established the abbreviated Comprehensive Mental Health Act, which pushed the department to establish plans surrounding community living. So in addition to creating a more humane environment, the state school was training their residents to be more equipped for community living and independence. The consent decrees also gave money to the town to build privately owned group homes because the movement of residents outside the state school was imminent, and so by 1986 there were plans for 57 homes. By 1989, the state had decided it wouldn't be worth it to leave the state school open because it would cost more to rebuild the deteriorating grounds than it would to move all the residents into community-style homes. And so in 1992, the state school officially closed, with the last 92 residents living in the infirmary, waiting to be moved to their next home. So as for why the state school closed, it wasn't just one thing that caused its closure. There were many reasons, but they can all be traced back to the decline in resources from World War II. After World War II, the school had lost so much funding and so many employees that the employees they had left were struggling to care for the current residents, and the state school could never fully recover, so it only continued to get worse until its fate was sealed with the release of The Tragedy of Belchertown by James M. Shanks.
Will you think of me when the west wind blows upon the fields of poppies? Will you speak my name, say a prayer for me as you walk the streets of home? With our friends we marched with our innocence to fight for freedom lost, and the few that came back to hearth and home never spoke of war again. As the whistle blew and our hearts were filled with thoughts of home and family, climbing from the trench over tops we spilled to run and then to fall. I never made the journey back home. The muddy ground of fences kept me, but I know that I'll see you again, and we'll walk in heaven's fields. Yes, we'll walk in heaven's fields. Now the rows of graves shining in the sun forever mark our passing. Will you speak my name, say a prayer for me as you walk the streets of home? I never made the journey back home. The muddy ground of fences kept me, but I know that I'll see you again, and we'll walk in heaven's fields. Yes, we'll walk in streets of gold. Will you think of me when the west wind blows upon the fields of poppies? Will you speak my name, say a prayer for me as you walk the streets of home? As you walk the streets of home, as you walk the streets of home. Will you think of me when the west wind blows upon the fields of poppies? Will you speak my name, say a prayer for me as you walk the streets of home? friends we marched with our innocence to fight for freedom lost, and the few that came back to hearth and home never spoke of war again. As the whistle blew and our hearts were filled with thoughts of home and family, climbing from the trench over tops we spilled to run and then to fall. I never made the journey back home. The muddy ground of fences kept me, but I know that I'll see you again, and we'll walk in heaven's fields. Yes, we'll walk in heaven's fields. Now the rows of graves shining in the sun forever mark our passing. Will you speak my name, say a prayer for me as you walk the streets of home? I never made the journey back home. The muddy ground of fences kept me, but I know that I'll see you again, and we'll walk in heaven's fields. Yes, we'll walk in streets of gold. Will you think of me when the west wind blows upon the fields of poppies? Will you speak my name, say a prayer for me as you walk the streets of home? As you walk the streets of home, as you walk the streets of home.